The conference room at Pemberton, Hartwell, smelled of old leather and rain. Adelaide Hartwell sat at the long table, pen trembling above the marriage certificate, her eyes red from a week of refusing to cry. Across from her, Nathan Brooks waited in a clean flannel shirt and worn boots. Royce Pemberton leaned against the back wall, swirling whiskey. He smiled without warmth. "The bride," he said for the record, "is signing under duress of her grandfather's will." A tear hit the paper. Nathan signed his name in 3 precise strokes. No one noticed the watch beneath his cuff. Everyone in that room saw a small-town mechanic marrying above his station. None of them realized he had been quietly auditing their company for 18 months. What would make a careful old man like Conrad Hartwell stake his granddaughter's inheritance on a man no one had ever heard of? 5 weeks earlier, on a gray morning in Portland, Maine, Adelaide Hartwell had stood in her grandfather's old corner office on the 40th floor of Hartwell Tower and listened to a man she had known since childhood explain that there was no way out. The lawyer, a careful man named Hollis Reed, had spent 8 months trying. He had filed motions, requested clarifications, written letters to the Boston firm that had drafted the document. Every door had closed. Conrad Hartwell had made certain of it before the cancer took him. Within 30 days of her 33rd birthday, the will read, Adelaide must enter into a lawful marriage with a man named Nathan Brooks, born in Cape Elizabeth on the 14th of March, 1988. Failure to do so would dissolve her controlling stake in Hartwell Maritime and redistribute it according to a formula that heavily favored the existing board. 3 days of that window had already passed. Adelaide read the page a second time. She did not raise her voice. She set the document down and asked Hollis to leave her alone for a moment. When the door closed, she walked to the tall window and looked out at the harbor. Her grandfather had been the most disciplined man she had ever known. He did not write whims into legal documents. Whatever this was, he had meant it. 2 hours south, in the small fishing town of Cape Elizabeth, a man in his late 30s was working under the hood of a Volvo Penta diesel inside the cluttered second bay of Brooks Marine Repair. He was tall and quiet, with sun-darkened forearms and a small scar at the edge of his left temple. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried the unhurried weight of someone who had stopped trying to impress anyone a long time ago. His daughter, 8-year-old Sophie, sat at a folding table in the office at the back of the shop, drawing a sloop on cheap printer paper. She had a careful set of crayons her father had bought her at the hardware store, and a serious crease between her eyebrows when she worked. Nathan came in around noon, washed grease from his hands, and made her a turkey sandwich. He cut the crust off because she still preferred it that way. Adelaide arrived at the shop the following afternoon in a gray suit that was almost certainly the most expensive thing the building had ever held. She waited at the open garage door until Nathan finished tightening a fitting and reached for a rag. He did not seem surprised to see her. He seemed, if anything, mildly resigned. She handed him a sealed envelope containing the relevant excerpt of the will. He read it in silence, standing in his coveralls in the middle of his own shop. When he finished, he folded the page back along its creases and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "He left no letter for you about this," he said. "Not a question, but close to one." "No," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need to think about it. Give me until tomorrow morning." She had come prepared for argument, for refusal, for greed. She was not prepared to be asked to wait. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the harbor, Nathan Brooks placed a call to a private number in Boston. The voice that answered was a woman's, dry and unsurprised. He spoke briefly. "Tell Margaret," he said, "that I said the time has come." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, "Understood." He hung up and put a pot of coffee on the stove. At 10, he called Adelaide. He would sign, he told her, with conditions. They would meet at her lawyer's office on Friday. The meeting at Hollis Reed's firm was scheduled for an hour. It took 3. Nathan read every page of the prenuptial agreement without skimming. Halfway through, he stopped at a paragraph on the 7th page, set down his pen, and asked whether the clawback equity provision in Section 14 had been intentional or whether someone had copied boilerplate from a Massachusetts template without adjusting for Maine corporate law. Hollis Reed, who had 31 years of practice and an ego to match, looked at the page, looked again, and quietly excused himself to redraft it. Adelaide watched her supposed mechanic from across the conference table and did not say anything for a long time. That afternoon she informed the Hartwell board. The room responded with the practiced silence of people who had already prepared their reactions. Royce Pemberton, the chief operating officer who had served under Conrad for 18 years and had expected to be named successor, spoke first. He expressed his concern gently for the company's public profile. He proposed an addendum, a strict prenuptial agreement, a confidentiality clause, and an exit provision permitting either party to terminate the arrangement after 12 months with minimal complications. Adelaide, who saw the shape of the trap but had no time to refuse it, agreed. Hartwell Maritime in those days was valued at roughly $1.6 billion. The company controlled a meaningful share of New England container traffic and held a long-running supply contract with the naval base at Portsmouth. A merger with Atlantic Freight, valued at $620 million, had been in negotiation for 9 months. Pemberton was leading the talks. After the board meeting, Pemberton drove to a parking garage 3 blocks east and placed a call from his car. Lenora Quinn, the chief financial officer, answered on the second ring. "She just handed us the gun," he said. "Once Atlantic Freight signs, we'll have her cornered by Christmas." A mile away, in the visitor lot beneath Hartwell Tower, Nathan Brooks sat in the cab of his Ford F-150 and dialed a number from memory. The voice on the other end was older, tired, and unsurprised. "You're really going to do this?" the voice said. Conrad asked. Nathan answered. "I'm doing it." He hung up, started the truck, and drove the slow coastal route back to Cape Elizabeth. He did not speed. He did not turn on the radio. He looked at the gray water and thought about a man who had been dead 8 months and a promise that was now coming due. 2 evenings after the civil signing, Royce Pemberton hosted what he called a welcome reception for the new member of the Hartwell family. The invitation list ran to 40 people. The full board, 3 senior partners from the merger team at Atlantic Freight, and a small handful of business press friends, introduced for the evening as old companions of the house. The venue was the long dining hall at Hartwell Estate, which had been Conrad's home and was now, by inheritance, Adelaide's. Sophie was not present. Nathan had asked, quietly, that his daughter be allowed to stay with her maternal grandmother for that week. Nathan arrived in a Ford F-150 from 2014 and a plain black suit that fit but had not been tailored. Pemberton's house manager hesitated at the front door and suggested, with a careful smile, that Mr. Brooks might be more comfortable using the side entrance, where deliveries arrived. Nathan looked at him without expression and walked past him through the main hall. The manager did not stop him. Dinner began with a kind of cordiality that was its own form of cruelty. Pemberton sat to Adelaide's right and made a point of including Nathan in conversation, the way a man might include a child at an adult table. He asked, with an expression of polite interest, what a marine repair shop in Cape Elizabeth grossed in a good year. He admired the watch on Nathan's wrist and asked whether it was a tribute piece or an estate sale find. He observed that Conrad had always said only family could sleep at the estate, and added with a small laugh how nice it was to see that policy expand. At each remark, the table produced a small, well-mannered laugh. Adelaide did not look up from her plate. Halfway through the second course, a senior board member raised his glass and offered a toast. "To Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," he said. "May the next 12 months teach us all something about compatibility." The laughter that followed was a little louder. A woman across the table touched a napkin to the corner of her mouth and turned away to hide her smile. Nathan answered the questions when asked. He used short, complete sentences. He drank water. He ate slowly and finished what was on his plate. He did not touch the wine. He did not lift his eyes more than once to look at his wife. Adelaide, who had grown up watching her grandfather hold rooms with silence, noticed something during the meal that disturbed her. Nathan was not enduring the evening. He was counting. There was a small movement of his attention, almost invisible, as each remark landed, as if he were entering each name and each laugh into a ledger she could not see. The look on his face was not anger. It was not hurt. It was something closer to inventory. After dinner, Pemberton produced an additional non-disclosure agreement and presented it to Nathan with a remark about handymen and master bedrooms. Nathan read the document, signed it, and slid it back across the table without comment. Walking to her room down the long upstairs hallway, Adelaide caught up to him at the turning by the library. "I should have said something," she said. Nathan stopped, looked at her, and answered with the same quiet voice he had used all night. "You didn't owe me that," he said. "Not yet." She did not understand the word yet. In the first week at Hartwell Estate, Adelaide gave Nathan the use of her grandfather's old study. It was the room she had not entered since the funeral. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the cold fireplace and the bookshelves and the worn leather chair, and then he walked in as if he were returning to a place he had once owned. He went to the cabinet beside the hearth, opened it without searching, and took out the brass kindling tongs. He stacked wood without thinking about which size to lay first. Adelaide stood in the doorway and watched and said nothing. She told him there was coffee downstairs at 6. Then she left him to it. The next morning, she came down at 1:15 and found him already at the breakfast table, with the Wall Street Journal folded to the shipping and logistics page. He was making notes in a small leather book with a fountain pen, a Mont Blanc that had been used hard enough to wear a shine on the cap. He looked up when she came in, nodded, and went back to his column. She had expected, vaguely, that the man she had married would watch sports highlights or scroll a phone. She had not expected an editorial calendar of freight indices and bunker fuel hedging schedules. She did not ask. She filed the observation and went to work. That weekend, the marina staff at the estate was preparing the Hartwell Hawk, a 75-foot yacht, for a paying charter the following Tuesday. The stabilization system would not initialize. 2 engineers had been at it for an hour. Walter Kowalski, the company's senior marine systems engineer, and a man who had served Hartwell for 36 years, stood on the dock with his arms folded. Nathan walked past, on his way back from the breakwater with Sophie's drawing of a sloop folded in his back pocket. He paused for perhaps 30 seconds, looked at the open access panel near the port fin, and spoke quietly to the younger of the 2 engineers. The hydraulic feed on the port side, he said, was reversed. Whoever had serviced the boat the week before had crossed 2 lines. The engineer checked. The lines were crossed. The system initialized within 10 minutes. Walter Kowalski looked across the dock at Nathan and held his gaze. The look that passed between them was very brief and entirely understood. Walter said nothing. He turned and walked back into the boathouse. Sophie came to the estate that Saturday afternoon. Adelaide had been working in her bedroom when she heard a small knock at her door. The girl stood in the hall with a coloring book held against her chest. "Excuse me," Sophie said, very politely. "Do you know where the blue crayons go?" Adelaide blinked, stood up, and walked the child down to the kitchen, where she opened a drawer and found a packet of crayons her own grandmother had bought her 2 decades earlier. Sophie thanked her quietly and went back upstairs. That night, Adelaide walked the upper hallway in her socks and stopped outside Sophie's bedroom. The door was open a finger's width. Nathan was reading Charlotte's Web aloud, in a voice she had not heard him use anywhere else. A voice that was almost a whisper but had every word in it. Adelaide stood in the dark hallway and listened until the chapter ended. Then she went back to her room and did not sleep. On the bookshelf in Nathan's study, between a worn copy of Moby Dick and a binder of marine engineering tables, sat a slim hardcover titled Maritime Risk and Hedging in Transatlantic Shipping. The author's name on the spine read N.A. Brooks. Adelaide had not yet seen it. In his office downtown, Royce Pemberton ended a call with Lenora Quinn by saying that Brooks was too quiet, and he did not trust quiet, and that the Atlantic freight signing needed to be moved up by a week. The call came at 2:40 in the morning, 11 days after the civil signing. The MV Hartwell Meridian, a container vessel of 280 meters, had lost steerage in a Category 3 storm off Nova Scotia. Several lashings had failed on the upper tier. The ship was listing 12 degrees, and the bridge was reporting that 2 of the boxes in the affected stack contained hazmat-classed cargo. 19 sailors were on board. Adelaide was in the back of a town car within 10 minutes. By the time she arrived at Hartwell Tower, Pemberton was already in the nav center on the 15th floor, leaning over the shoulder of the duty officer. He turned when she came in and spoke quickly, with the controlled urgency of someone who had been rehearsing the conversation for some time. The captain, he said, had requested a southern reroute 3 days earlier to avoid the system. The request, he said, had been denied at the executive level on fuel cost grounds. Adelaide asked evenly who had denied it. That, Pemberton said, was what they were trying to determine. She watched him while he spoke. She had known the man since she was 16 years old. She did not believe him. Within 40 minutes, the European pre-market opened and Hartwell Maritime stock fell 7%. By 4 o'clock, the wire services had picked up the story. The Canadian Coast Guard reported that weather conditions would not permit helicopter evacuation for at least 6 hours. The seas were running at 5 meters and rising. The ship's list had reached 14 degrees. Pemberton placed a slim folder in front of her on the nav center table. The folder contained a draft press statement and a one-page insurance election. He suggested gently that she might want to consider declaring the vessel a probable total loss in order to begin the claims process before further damage occurred. Adelaide read the page once. She read it again. She understood, suddenly, what he was doing. If she signed, the company would record the loss before the rescue had even been attempted. The market would crater. The board would have all the reason it needed to call an emergency vote of no confidence. She did not sign. Pemberton stepped out, ostensibly to call the insurance carrier, and she stood in the middle of the room with 19 lives on the screens above her, and no idea what to do next. She drove herself back to Hartwell Estate. The road from Portland was nearly empty at that hour. She did not turn on the radio. She did not call anyone. 50 minutes later, she walked into the kitchen of her grandfather's house and found Nathan Brooks sitting at the table in a faded flannel shirt, pouring coffee from a French press. He looked up at her without surprise. "Meridian," he said. She stared at him. "It's been on the coastal emergency feed since 1, he said. "I was up. Sophie had a bad dream." She sat down across from him and told him, in short sentences, what was happening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question: who denied the reroute? "Pemberton," she said. He set the coffee down. For a moment he looked at the steam coming off the cup. Then he looked at her. "Take me to your nav center," he said. "There's a manual ballast protocol most crews don't remember. I can talk the captain through it. We have a window." "You're a boat mechanic," she said. It came out closer to a question than she meant. He held her gaze. "I'm a man who used to underwrite shipping insurance for vessels this size," he said. "Try me. Or don't. Your call." In the next 90 seconds, she did not move for 10 of those seconds. Then she stood up and reached for her car keys. By 4:15, Nathan Brooks was inside the Hartwell Nav Center, standing one seat back from the duty officer at the lead console. Pemberton blocked the doorway when he saw him, and said, in the careful voice of a man trying to control a room, that this was not appropriate, that Mr. Brooks had no clearance, that the situation required focus. Adelaide stepped between them. "I'm authorizing it," she said. "Step aside, Royce." Pemberton stepped aside. His face hardened in a way that did not show but could be felt. Nathan did not take the duty officer's chair. He stood at his shoulder and asked 3 questions, each one short. The duty officer answered. Nathan watched the AIS plot and the trim readouts and the wind data for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he spoke, slowly and clearly, so that the duty officer could repeat his words to the captain over the radio without losing any of them. "Tell him to flood ballast tanks 4 and 6 to 50% capacity," Nathan said. "Vent tank 1 entirely. Then tell him to turn into the swell, not away. He'll feel like he's making it worse for the first 3 minutes. He's not. He'll regain 6 degrees within 20. The duty officer hesitated. The protocol was not standard. He turned to Walter Kowalski, who had quietly entered the nav center 2 minutes earlier and was standing near the wall with his arms folded. Walter looked at Nathan and gave the duty officer a single small nod. "Do it," Walter said. "He's right." The order went out over the radio. The next 20 minutes were the longest the room had ever endured. Then, at 4:36 in the morning Atlantic time, the captain of the Meridian reported that the list had stabilized at 8 degrees and was reducing. By 5 to 10, the ship was holding at 4 degrees. The hazmat stack had not shifted. By 6, the helicopter window had opened and the crew was being lifted off in pairs. 19 sailors, all of them, came home. When the immediate crisis ended, the nav center fell into the particular silence of people who had not expected to live through what they had just lived through. Pemberton stood in the corner, his face the color of old paper. He looked across the room at Walter Kowalski. Walter looked back and looked away. Adelaide stayed in her seat for a long minute. Then she turned to Nathan and asked him quietly how he had known the protocol. "It's in the IMO supplement annex," he said. Most captains don't bother to memorize it because it only applies to vessels over 25,000 tons. She watched his face. "Why do you know it?" she said. "I'll tell you," he said. "Not tonight." When the daylight came, the nav team stood up and clapped him on the shoulder one by one as they left. Pemberton did not. He waited until Nathan stepped into the corridor alone and then followed him. "Don't think one lucky call makes you part of this company," Pemberton said. "Stay in your lane." Nathan stopped. He turned slowly, looked at Pemberton, and let the silence sit between them long enough to be felt. "Careful, Mr. Pemberton," he said, at a register only the two of them could hear. Conrad used to say the same thing to men who didn't last long here. Then he walked on. Pemberton stood alone in the corridor and did not move for some time. Out in the parking lot, Walter Kowalski caught up with Nathan beside the truck. The two men spoke briefly, the wind off the harbor pulling at their jackets. "He's moved up the Atlantic freight signing," Walter said. "Friday morning, 10 sharp." "I know," Nathan said. "I have until Thursday night." Walter nodded once, looked at the harbor, and walked back toward the building. Nathan stood there a moment longer, then opened the door of his truck and got in. That night, Adelaide could not sleep. At a little after 2 in the morning, she walked the dark hallway of Hartwell Estate to her grandfather's old study. She had not entered the room voluntarily in almost a year. Nathan, she knew, was not there. He had left after dinner without explaining where he was going, and she had not asked. She turned on the lamp at the corner desk and sat down in the chair. The study smelled the way it had always smelled. Pipe tobacco that had not been smoked in this room for 2 decades, paper, and the faintest trace of the sea. She let her eyes wander over the bookshelves. After a moment, she stood and walked to the row Nathan had been keeping his own books on. She pulled the slim hardcover with the worn spine. Maritime Risk and Hedging in Transatlantic Shipping. N.A. Brooks. She opened to the title page. A handwritten inscription filled the upper third of the page, in her grandfather's familiar slanted script. For Nate, it read, "For the conversations we never had to finish. Ch. 2019. Adelaide sat down on the edge of the desk and held the book in her lap for a long time without moving. She began, slowly, to look through the other books on the shelf. Marine Insurance Underwriting, a bound volume of Admiralty case law, 3 years of the Journal of Commerce, with marginalia in the same fountain pen hand she had seen at the breakfast table. The room around her began to feel like a place she had walked into without understanding. In the second drawer of the desk, unlocked, she found a small unlabeled envelope. Inside was a single black and white photograph. 2 men stood on the deck of a freighter, the rigging behind them in the soft focus of an old camera. The younger man wore a windbreaker. The older, who could not have been more than 40, was unmistakably her grandfather. On the back of the print, in pencil, someone had written, "M.V. Atlantic Sentinel, Sea Trials, October 1988, Nate B.A. and me." She stared at the initials for a long time before she understood that they were not B period, A period. They were 2 letters that began 2 names. She went to her own bedroom, opened her laptop, and typed in the words, N.A. Brooks Maritime Risk Hedging. The author's full name appeared in the second result, in a sidebar from the Journal of Commerce. Nathaniel A. Brooks Ashford. She typed Ashford Holdings. The first result was a single-page company website, austere and informative, dated to a most recent update of 3 years prior. Ashford Holdings, the page read, was a privately held maritime and logistics company, founded in 1962, headquartered in Boston, with subsidiary operations in Houston, Long Beach, and Hamburg. The page listed no photographs and no executives. She found a Forbes profile from 2018, 2 paragraphs long. The estimated net worth of the chairman, given in cautious editorial language, ranged from $5 to $7 billion. The article noted that he had not granted an interview to the press in over a decade. Adelaide closed the laptop, and then she opened it again, and then she closed it. She sat very still in her chair for what might have been an hour. She had married, by force, one of the wealthiest private men in America. She had let a room of people humiliate him, and he had let her. In the morning, when she came down to the kitchen, Sophie was at the table with a coloring book and a juice box. The girl looked up, smiled in a small, careful way, and said, "My daddy makes good pancakes if you want some." Adelaide sat down. Nathan, in his flannel shirt, stood at the stove and did not turn around. The three of them ate together. Sophie showed Adelaide how to draw a sailboat in syrup on top of the pancake. Adelaide did not trust her voice that morning. Across town, Royce Pemberton sent Lenora Quinn a single text message. Friday, 10 sharp. Once Atlantic Freight is signed, the board meets at noon. Vote of no confidence, she's done. Thursday evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Adelaide carried the book and the photograph downstairs and laid them on the desk in her grandfather's study. Nathan was already there, reading by the lamp. He looked up at her arrival, and then at the items she had placed in front of him. "You're him," she said. "I am," he said. There was no preamble, no raising of voices. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He considered the question for a long moment, as if he had been waiting for it but had not decided in advance what to answer. "Because if I had told you on day one," he said, "you would have used me as a shield. Conrad didn't want that. He wanted you to see the company, and yourself, clearly first, before someone handed you a weapon." She sat down across from him. "And now," she said. "Now," he said, "Royce Pemberton is signing Atlantic Freight tomorrow morning at 10. The board has been called for noon. They will vote you out. I have a folder. You can decide what to do with it." He took a flash drive from his shirt pocket and set it on the desk between them. She did not touch it for a moment. Then she picked it up, walked back to her room, and read every file until the gray light came up over the harbor. At 9:50 the next morning, in the boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hartwell Tower, Royce Pemberton signed the Atlantic Freight merger documents on a polished cherrywood table, while two Atlantic Freight executives nodded their congratulations. He returned to the boardroom with the signed pages held lightly in one hand, like a man who had been waiting a long time for permission to smile. The board meeting opened at noon. Lenora Quinn distributed a folder of financial summaries, showing what she called a pattern of erratic executive behavior on Adelaide's part over the previous 6 months. Pemberton spoke for 14 minutes. He cited the Meridian crisis, the 7% stock drop, the introduction of an unauthorized civilian to the nav center during an active incident. He used the phrase corporate governance failure 3 times. He proposed a vote of no confidence and his own appointment as interim chief executive officer. Adelaide stood when he finished. "Before the vote," she said, "I would like to introduce a witness." The door opened. Nathan Brooks walked in. He was wearing a charcoal suit that did not call attention to itself, an open-collared shirt, and the same worn boots he wore everywhere. Behind him came 3 people. A tall, silver-haired attorney from Boston, a forensic accountant carrying 2 bankers' boxes, and Walter Kowalski. Pemberton rose halfway out of his chair. "This is a closed session," he said. "Mr. Brooks has no standing here." Under Section 12 of the marriage clause Mr. Pemberton himself helped draft, Nathan said, "I am a 51% voting equity holder in this company. I have standing." He set a black file folder on the table. "Before the vote," he said, "I would like to enter evidence." The folder contained 3 sets of documents. The first was a chain of internal emails from Pemberton, time-stamped and hash-verified by the Hartwell server's own audit log, in which he had personally overridden the captain's requests to reroute the Meridian around the storm system. The second was a forensic accounting reconstruction of the Atlantic Freight merger, which valued Hartwell Maritime at $1.1 billion, more than 30% below the independent valuation, prepared by an outside firm 3 months earlier. The third traced a chain of payments from Atlantic Freight through 3 shell companies, terminating in a Cayman entity whose beneficial owners were Royce Pemberton and Lenora Quinn. Pemberton went very white and said, almost calmly, that the documents were fabricated. The silver-haired attorney placed a second folder on the table without speaking. Server hashes, bank correspondence, subpoenaed wire records. Nathan let the room sit with what had just been said. Then he spoke once more, in a voice no louder than the one he had used at the kitchen table the night before. "Conrad asked me to keep an eye on this company until his granddaughter could stand on her own," he said. "I've done that. As of today, I'm not watching anymore. I'm voting." Walter Kowalski stood up beside him and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Pemberton, who had not yet sat back down, looked at Nathan and said, with the last of his composure, "Who are you, Mr. Brooks? Who do you think you are?" The silver-haired attorney rose and answered him. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "is Nathaniel A. Brooks Ashford, chairman of Ashford Holdings. Over the past 11 months, At the personal request of the late Conrad Hartwell, Ashford Holdings has acquired 34% of Hartwell Maritime's senior debt. Conrad retained Ashford as a confidential advisor in 2023. Through that creditor position and the equity granted by the marriage clause, Mr. Brooks Ashford holds majority voting control of this room. The board was silent. One member, an older woman near the end of the table, leaned forward. "Brooks Ashford," she said. "Of the Ashford that ran the Sentinel fleet." "The same," Walter Kowalski said. He spoke for the first time. "I served 8 years under his father." Conrad and Nate ran Maritime Risk Consulting together in the 80s, before either of them inherited a dollar. Adelaide, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, looked across the table at her husband. For the first time, she used the name only Conrad had ever used. "Nate," she said. He met her eyes and nodded once. He spoke briefly to the board. He explained that he and Conrad had been partners and friends for 30 years, that his wife, Margaret, had died in 2022 of pancreatic cancer, that he had stepped back from the operating chairmanship of Ashford after her death and moved with his daughter to Cape Elizabeth, where the air smelled like home and no one took her picture at the school gate, that Conrad had been diagnosed with lung cancer 18 months before his death, and had known by then that Pemberton was building something quiet beneath the floor, and had not had the time or the proof to act on it himself. The advisory contract, Nathan said, was legal, lodged with the Boston firm, and properly disclosed in Conrad's private files. The marriage clause had not been a romantic gesture. It had been the cleanest legal instrument available, under Maine corporate law, to give him standing inside the Hartwell boardroom without triggering panic in the public credit markets through a hostile creditor declaration. Adelaide spoke softly. "He could have just told me," she said. "He thought you'd reject the help," Nathan said. He may have been right. The vote came 20 minutes later. By a margin that was not close, Royce Pemberton and Lenora Quinn were stripped of their offices, suspended pending the outcome of a federal criminal inquiry, and removed from the building by internal security before the lunch hour ended. The silver-haired attorney had already placed a call to the FBI's Maritime Crimes Unit in Boston. Endangerment of 19 merchant mariners through a willful denial of safe routing was a federal offense. The Atlantic freight transaction would be unwound within 10 days. Pemberton, escorted past the boardroom door, stopped and turned toward Adelaide. He spoke without raising his voice. "He lied to you for 6 weeks," he said. "You'll never trust him again. He'll always be the man who didn't tell you." The room waited. "Get out, Royce," Adelaide said. He went. When the board members had filed out, and the attorneys had packed their boxes, and Walter Kowalski had quietly closed the door behind them, Adelaide and Nathan were left alone in the boardroom for the first time. Neither of them sat down. Sunlight moved across the cherrywood table. Below the window, the harbor went about its business. She did not look at him for a long moment. Then she did. "I need time," she said. "Take it," Nathan said. "Sophie and I will be at the house." He walked to the door. He paused there with his hand on the brass handle, the way a man pauses when he is not certain whether the next minute belongs to him. "I should have told you," he said without turning around. "I won't pretend I shouldn't have." Then he opened the door and walked out. And Adelaide stood by the window for a long time afterward and watched the boats move on the gray water and did not cry. 12 days passed before she drove to Cape Elizabeth. It was a Tuesday morning at the edge of November. She took her own car, an older sedan she had not used in months, and she made the trip alone. The drive south followed the coast road past low marshes and clapboard houses, with lobster traps stacked against their fences. She had never paid attention to any of it before. The Brooks house was a 2-story Cape Cod cottage on a narrow road above a stretch of stony beach. There was no gate, no name on the mailbox, no sign that the man who lived there had ever owned anything more than the truck in the driveway. A wreath of dried bittersweet hung on the front door. Sophie was on the porch with a sketch pad balanced on her knees. She looked up when Adelaide came up the gravel path. Her face did not show surprise. "You came," she said. "I came," Adelaide said. She climbed the porch steps and sat down on the bench beside the girl. Sophie turned the sketch pad so she could see. It was not a picture of a family. It was a small sailboat at dawn, with the colors of the sky carefully blended at the edges. "My daddy says you grew up in Boston," Sophie said, not looking up. "Did you see boats like this when you were little?" Adelaide told her, very quietly, about a grandmother who had taken her down to the docks on Saturday mornings when she was 7. She told her about the smell of the harbor and the men with their coffee and the gulls. Sophie listened with the careful attention of a child who had not been raised to interrupt. The front door opened. Nathan stepped out onto the porch in his flannel and his boots. He looked at Adelaide for a long moment, then at his daughter, then back at Adelaide. "You want coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said. He brought 2 mugs out and set them on the small porch table and sat down on the bench across from her. Sophie disappeared back inside in search of a different color of paint. "I judged you on the first day," Adelaide said. "I let other people humiliate you. I told myself I didn't have a choice. I did. I just didn't take it. I'm sorry." He was silent for a long time. The wind moved through the bittersweet on the door. "I lied by omission for 6 weeks," he said. "I told myself I had reasons. I did. They were still reasons. I'm sorry too." She looked at the gray water beyond the porch rail. "There's a 12-month clause," she said. "We can end it in March. Or," he said, "we can stop counting." She did not answer at first. Sophie came back out with a small wooden box of watercolors and set it between them with the seriousness of a child handing over a trust. She showed Adelaide how to wet the brush and how to mix the blues. "You have to wait for the first layer to dry," she said. "Daddy says everything good takes layers." Adelaide picked up the brush. On the table between them, beside the cooling coffee, Nathan's old watch lay quietly, unworn that morning. He had left it there as a small kind of answer. Neither of them had been looking. But somewhere between Portland and Cape Elizabeth, on a porch that smelled of salt and turpentine, they had stopped running.